May 11th, 2022. 4:23 a.m. Siverskyi Donets River, near Bilohorivka, Luhansk Oblast. Russian forces were attempting something dangerous, a river crossing under combat conditions. They had assembled a battalion tactical group, approximately 550 soldiers, 50 vehicles including T-72 tanks, BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, MTLB armored personnel carriers, and support trucks. Their objective was to establish a bridgehead on the western bank of the Siverskyi Donets River, then push toward Ukrainian positions 8 kilometers beyond. Russian engineers had spent 2 days constructing a pontoon bridge. The bridge, assembled from PMP floating bridge sections, stretched 40 meters across the river. At 4:23 a.m., the first Russian vehicles began crossing. BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles led, followed by tanks. Russian commanders were confident. They had air reconnaissance showing limited Ukrainian forces in the area. Their own air defense systems, positioned on the eastern bank, would protect the crossing site. Artillery batteries stood ready to suppress any Ukrainian resistance. What Russian commanders didn't know was that Ukrainian forces had been watching for 48 hours. Drones tracked every movement. Ukrainian artillery, positioned 15 kilometers away, had pre-registered every coordinate. The river crossing, the approaches, the staging areas. Everything was mapped. Ukrainian forces had only to wait for the right moment, the moment when the maximum number of Russian vehicles were trapped on the bridge, unable to advance, unable to retreat, clustered in a kill zone 40 meters long and 10 meters wide. That moment came at 4:31 a.m. This is Warfist TV, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Because what happened at Bilohorivka over the next 18 minutes would destroy an entire Russian battalion tactical group. Not through close combat, not through airstrikes, but through precision artillery fire on a target that couldn't move. Welcome to the most devastating river crossing disaster of modern warfare. Hit subscribe. You need to see how Ukrainian artillery turned a river into Russia's graveyard. River crossings are among the most dangerous military operations. Armies must compress forces at crossing points. Vehicles line up, movement slows. Units become vulnerable to artillery fire. Military doctrine requires several conditions for successful river crossings. First, air superiority. Without control of the sky, enemy aircraft can strike exposed crossing forces. Second, suppression of enemy artillery. Counter-battery fire must destroy or suppress enemy guns before they can fire on the crossing site. Third, rapid execution. The longer a crossing takes, the more time the enemy has to concentrate forces and fire. Fourth, deception. The enemy must not know where or when the crossing will occur. Russian forces at Bilohorivka failed every condition. Ukrainian drones maintained continuous surveillance. Russian counter-battery fire was ineffective, failing to locate or suppress Ukrainian artillery. The crossing took hours, not minutes, as vehicles queued and moved slowly across the pontoon bridge. And Ukrainian forces knew exactly where and when the crossing would happen. Russian tactical doctrine, inherited from Soviet-era planning, assumed that battalion tactical groups could execute complex operations like river crossings with minimal preparation. The plan at Bilohorivka was straightforward. Russian engineers build a pontoon bridge under darkness. At dawn, a battalion tactical group crosses. Armored vehicles establish a defensive perimeter on the western bank. Infantry follows. Artillery provides fire support from the eastern bank. Once the bridgehead is secure, additional forces cross and the offensive continues. The plan failed in execution. First, Russian forces took too long to assemble. The battalion tactical group, which should have concentrated quickly, spent 2 days moving into position. This gave Ukrainian forces time to identify the crossing site and position artillery for maximum effect. Second, Russian air defense was inadequate. Panzer S-1 and Tor M2 short-range systems covered the crossing site, but Ukrainian drones operated beyond their effective range. Ukrainian TB2 Bayraktar drones loitered at 20,000 feet, tracking Russian movements without being engaged. Third, Russian forces concentrated vehicles without proper dispersion. Soviet doctrine emphasized tight formations for command and control, but this created dense target clusters vulnerable to artillery. At 4:23 a.m., when the crossing began, dozens of Russian vehicles were packed into a 300-meter area on the eastern bank, waiting their turn to cross. At 4:31 a.m., 6 vehicles were on the 40-meter bridge. 12 more were on the western bank. having just crossed. Another 30 vehicles waited on the eastern bank. Ukrainian artillery had been waiting for this moment, the maximum concentration of Russian forces, the minimum ability to maneuver or escape. At 4:32 a.m., Ukrainian 150mm howitzers opened fire. The artillery batteries, positioned 15 kilometers southwest, had pre-plotted fire missions on 8 key coordinates: the pontoon bridge itself, the eastern bank staging area, the western bank bridgehead, approach roads on both sides. Each coordinate had been laser measured using drones. Each fire mission had been calculated for maximum effect. The first salvo, 12 150-ton high explosive shells, landed on the pontoon bridge and the vehicles crossing it. The bridge, constructed from aluminum pontoon sections, offered no protection. The shells, each carrying 43 pounds of high explosive, detonated on impact. The first shell struck a BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicle midway across the bridge. The vehicle exploded, its ammunition cooking off. The explosion severed 2 pontoon sections. The bridge began sinking. The BMP-3, now on fire and half submerged, blocked the crossing. 2 T-72B3 tanks, one ahead of the BMP-3 and one behind, were trapped. The tank on the western side attempted to move forward, but its path was blocked by vehicles that had already crossed. The tank on the eastern side attempted to reverse, but vehicles behind it prevented movement. Both tanks were immobilized on a sinking, burning bridge. The second salvo targeted the eastern bank staging area. 18 shells landed across a 200-meter zone where Russian vehicles waited to cross. 3 direct hits on armored vehicles. One hit destroyed a BTR-80 armored personnel carrier, killing 8 soldiers inside. Another hit struck a fuel truck, igniting 10,000 liters of diesel. The resulting fireball engulfed 3 nearby vehicles. A third hit disabled an MTLB armored personnel carrier. The remaining shells landed among unarmored support vehicles, trucks, and troop concentrations. Fragmentation from the high explosive shells shredded soft-skinned vehicles and killed or wounded exposed personnel. Russian forces attempted to respond. Artillery batteries on the eastern bank, 2 S-19 MSTAS self-propelled howitzers, fired counter-battery missions based on estimated Ukrainian positions. But Ukrainian artillery was using shoot-and-scoot tactics, firing 3 to 4 rounds, then immediately relocating. Russian counter-battery fire landed on empty positions. Russian air defense attempted to engage Ukrainian drones, but the drones, flying at 20,000 feet, were beyond the range of Pantsir S-1 systems designed for lower altitude threats. The drones continued providing targeting data to Ukrainian artillery. At 4:38 a.m., 6 minutes into the engagement, the pontoon bridge was destroyed. Partially sunk, partially burning, it was impassable. Russian vehicles on the western bank were cut off from support. Those on the eastern bank couldn't cross. Ukrainian artillery shifted fire to the western bank. 12 vehicles, mostly BMP-3s and MTLBs, were trapped in an area 100 meters by 200 meters. Russian forces attempted to disperse, but the terrain offered limited options. The river to their east, Ukrainian defensive positions to their west, forested areas to the north and south. Ukrainian artillery fired for effect. 20 shells landed on the western bank concentration, 8 direct hits on vehicles. 1 shell struck a BMP-3, penetrating its thin top armor and detonating inside. The vehicle brewed up, its turret blown off by internal ammunition explosion. Another shell hit an MTLB. The armor couldn't stop the 152mm shell's penetration. The vehicle was destroyed, its crew killed. Russian infantry dismounted from vehicles sought cover in tree lines. Ukrainian artillery shifted to airburst fuses, detonating shells 20 meters above ground. This created a rain of shrapnel that killed or wounded exposed personnel. By 4:45 a.m., Russian forces on the western bank were combat ineffective. Half their vehicles destroyed or disabled. Casualties exceeding 50%. No way to retreat. Ukrainian ground forces, positioned 2 kilometers west, began moving forward to engage survivors. Which tactic was most effective? A. Pre-registered artillery fire. B. Drone surveillance. C. Targeting the bridge. Comment below. At 4:50 a.m., Ukrainian artillery shifted focus to the eastern bank. The priority was preventing Russian forces from attempting another crossing or providing fire support. 30 shells targeted the remaining Russian vehicles and artillery positions. A 2 S-19 MSTAS howitzer attempting to fire counter-battery missions took a direct hit. The 150mm shell penetrated the howitzer's thin armor and detonated inside. The vehicle exploded, its ammunition and propellant charges cooking off in a series of secondary explosions. A second artillery piece, a 2S-3 Akatsiya self-propelled howitzer, was struck by shrapnel. The vehicle didn't explode, but its crew abandoned it, fleeing into nearby forests. Russian command vehicles, identifiable by their multiple antennas, were priority targets. Ukrainian artillery destroyed 2 command vehicles, disrupting Russian coordination and communication. Without functioning command vehicles, Russian forces couldn't organize a coherent response. Pantsir S-1 air defense systems attempted to reposition away from the kill zone, but movement made them visible to Ukrainian drones. Ukrainian artillery tracked them and fired. One Pantsir S-1 took a near-direct hit. Shrapnel damaged its radar array, rendering it unable to track or engage targets. By 5 a.m., 37 minutes after Ukrainian artillery began firing, the Battle of Bilohorivka was effectively over. Russian forces on the western bank were destroyed or captured. The pontoon bridge was destroyed. Russian vehicles on the eastern bank were scattered, many abandoned by their crews. The Battalion tactical group, 550 soldiers and 50 vehicles strong, had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Ukrainian forces estimated Russian casualties at 400 to 485 soldiers. Approximately 70 killed immediately from artillery fire. Another 180 to 200 wounded, many critically. Approximately 150 to 235 captured over the following days as Russian forces, cut off and without supplies, surrendered to Ukrainian forces. Equipment losses were catastrophic. 12 T-72B3 tanks destroyed or abandoned. 23 BMP-3 and MT-LB armored vehicles destroyed. 3 2S-19 MSTAS and 2S-3 Akatsiya self-propelled howitzers destroyed. 1 Pantsir S-1 air defense system damaged. Multiple trucks, fuel vehicles, and support equipment destroyed. Total equipment value exceeded $150 million. The strategic impact extended beyond one destroyed battalion. The Bilohorivka crossing was part of Russia's eastern offensive in Luhansk Oblast. The offensive's goal was to encircle Ukrainian forces defending Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Crossing the Siverskyi Donets River was critical to outflanking Ukrainian defenses. The crossing's failure forced Russian forces to attack frontally, directly into prepared Ukrainian positions. This slowed the offensive, inflicted additional casualties, and bought Ukraine time to reinforce defenses. Russian morale suffered significantly. Soldiers who survived Bilohorivka reported to their units that Ukrainian artillery was devastatingly accurate, that Russian air defense couldn't stop Ukrainian drones, that river crossings were suicide missions. This fear made Russian forces hesitant to attempt similar operations. Ukrainian morale, by contrast, soared. Bilohorivka proved that well-coordinated artillery and drone surveillance could destroy superior Russian forces. It validated Western weapon systems and NATO training, and it showed that Ukrainian forces could not only defend, but could decisively defeat Russian attacks. International recognition followed. Satellite imagery of destroyed Russian vehicles spread across media worldwide. Military analysts studied Bilohorivka as a textbook example of how to defend against river crossings. NATO officers used the battle in training scenarios. The tactical lessons were clear and brutal. First, river crossings require air superiority. Russian forces attempted a crossing while Ukrainian drones maintained constant surveillance. This allowed Ukrainian artillery to track and target with precision. Second, speed is critical. The longer a crossing takes, the more vulnerable forces become. Russian forces took hours to cross, creating a persistent target for Ukrainian artillery. Third, dispersion saves lives. Russian forces concentrated vehicles, creating dense targets. Ukrainian artillery exploited this, achieving multiple kills per salvo. Fourth, command and control are essential. Ukrainian forces maintained coordination between drones, artillery, and ground units. Russian forces, after losing command vehicles, couldn't respond effectively. Fifth, logistics matter. Russian forces on the western bank, cut off from supplies, couldn't sustain operations. Ukrainian forces, operating on interior lines with shorter supply routes, maintained pressure. The Battle of Bilohorivka became one of the worst military disasters of the war for Russian forces. A battalion tactical group, the primary maneuver unit of Russian ground forces, was annihilated in 37 minutes. The loss of 550 trained soldiers and 50 vehicles significantly degraded Russian offensive capability in Luhansk Oblast. For Ukraine, Bilohorivka was validation. Validation of tactics, training, and Western support. It showed that Ukrainian forces, with the right tools and tactics, could defeat Russian forces decisively. The Siverskyi Donets River, previously unremarkable, became a symbol of Ukrainian defensive capability. Russian forces attempted no more river crossings in that area. The river became a de facto boundary, respected by both sides. The pontoon bridge, partially submerged and destroyed, remained visible in satellite imagery for months. A reminder of what happens when outdated tactics meet modern firepower. The answer to the quiz? A. Pre-registered artillery fire. While drone surveillance provided targeting data and destroying the bridge-trapped Russian forces, pre-registered artillery fire was the decisive factor. Ukrainian gunners had calculated firing solutions days in advance. When the moment came, they fired with precision. 200-plus shells in 37 minutes. Hit rates exceeding 60% on pre-registered targets. This wasn't lucky. This was preparation meeting opportunity. Think about the tactical situation. Russian forces attempted a complex operation, a river crossing, without proper preparation. They didn't suppress Ukrainian artillery. They didn't achieve air superiority. They concentrated forces without dispersion. They moved slowly, giving Ukraine time to react. Every tactical principle violated, every violation punished. The result was inevitable. Ukrainian forces, with fewer troops and less equipment, destroyed a Russian battalion tactical group. 550 Russian soldiers, 50 vehicles, $150 million on equipment, gone in 37 minutes. Because preparation, coordination, and precision defeated numerical superiority. Bilohorivka taught Russian forces a harsh lesson. Ukrainian forces were not a pushover. Ukrainian artillery was accurate and deadly. Ukrainian drones provided constant surveillance. And Ukrainian tactics, informed by NATO training and Western weapon systems, could exploit Russian weaknesses ruthlessly. After Bilohorivka, Russian offensive operations in eastern Ukraine slowed significantly. Commanders became cautious. Troops became fearful. The offensive that was supposed to encircle Ukrainian forces in Siverskyi Donetsk and Lysychansk took months instead of weeks. And when Russian forces finally captured those cities in late June 2022, the cost had been enormous. Was Ukraine right to focus on destroying the crossing? Should Russian forces have attempted the crossing at night? What would you have done differently? Comment below. And if you believe preparation defeats improvisation, type Warfist TV in the comments. Your engagement shares this tactical analysis with people studying modern warfare. Subscribe to Warfist TV because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Siverskyi Donets River flows quietly now, but the wrecks remain. Rusting tanks, burnt-out vehicles. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes tactical mistakes without mercy. Stay vigilant.